So firstly, going to explore the challenge. So essentially, Unilever had a requirement to review around 18,000 contracts in relation to around 20 business critical data points in the context of an M&A transaction. So for want of a better phrase, due diligence for those who are more familiar with that process. Fairly common use case. Lots of organizations go through it, and typically and historically, in-house legal teams have looked to law firms to provide these services for them. It's worth kind of noting that the cost and the timescales were really critical for Unilever in this context. An early analysis suggested that it would take around 9,000 hours for a full human review of those contracts. And Unilever actually only had 3 months in which to do this in total, which ultimately required 19 resources full-time being dedicated to this inside of Unilever. So it presented a real opportunity to kind of leverage technology and think about how we could transform how services are delivered. So thinking about the solution itself, so as I mentioned before, we utilized DocuSign Insights, which is one of the leading market-leading AI contract review platforms. And it was a technology which was already in Unilever's tech stack, which was a great starting point for us. So we jointly analysed required outcomes for Unilever and ultimately designed a hybrid approach, layering kind of human QA and validation over an AI extraction process. So I'm just going to pause there quickly because I'm conscious that not everybody joining us today will be familiar with kind of using AI for this kind of purpose. And so just to kind of explain that, it essentially means that we're utilising AI and automated technology to undertake kind of an initial review and a first pass of each and every contract to automatically extract those required data points that were in scope for the project. And then what we did on top of that was then layer on kind of human resource to validate those outputs, layering in kind of an additional senior lawyer QC layer over top of that as well. And the main reason for doing that is to ensure accuracy. So AI technology is really good. It's getting really advanced, and year on year, the kind of models are getting better and better as the technology improves, but also as the technology learns from more and more data and use cases that it sees. But it's still not perfect, as humans aren't either. And I'm going to explore that a little bit later on in this session. But the whole purpose of layering on this human approach is to ensure the quality of that data. I guess the other piece just to kind of pause and reflect on here is that the first part of that design piece wasn't technology-led. So before we jumped to any technology, there was a real focus and a real exploration of the actual business problem and the use case, looking at what it is that Unilever were trying to achieve, what was the desired outcome, and how could we all work together to kind of deliver some strategic value above and beyond just kind of delivering the literal requirements of a project. So moving on to the solution itself, we kind of leveraged a lot of out-of-the-box policies, and we also built some new custom extraction policies to meet requirements. So again, just to quickly break that down a little bit, a lot of the leading legal AI products out there, they come pre-trained to some extent. So it basically enables the user of those products to leverage the expertise and the experience of existing customers and data sets that the technology's seen before. So that we can automatically extract a whole host of data points kind of out of the box. So as soon as you turn the technology on, without much need for configuration. And as you might expect, in a due diligence use case, in a contract migration into a CLM use case, many customers are looking for the same kind of data points, and the same use cases kind of come up again and again. So it's kind of really great that everybody can leverage from the training that's already sat inside the technology. And I think that was kind of one of the key points for us here that we discussed at length at the start of this project is let's not try and reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of great technology out there like DocuSign Insights. So let's utilize it, let's leverage what exists for us and make our job as easy as possible. But I think the important piece to think about is that a lot of kind of effort goes into the design there. And it's also thinking about how can you make improvements to kind of some of the out-of-the-box policies and some of the existing functionality in the platform. So I think one of the examples to think about there, contracting parties is one of the really common data points that we look to leverage AI for. But actually, whilst it's very easy for a human to kind of look at the front page of a contract or the recitals to work out who the parties are, the kind of the patterns that emerge and whether the algorithms are trained, actually those data points can be quite difficult to train the technology to look for. So quite often we see the party extractions out of the box, typically somewhere between 50 and 70% accurate. So what we did at the start of this project was build out a list of all relevant Unilever entities. And then we built some basically custom logic into the platform, which layered in the list of Unilever entities so that the AI model was then looking for a specific list in the context of the wider review that it was doing. And that saw us increase the accuracy on that data point from around 55% to 98% on the transaction. So quickly moving on to the kind of outcomes. So really exciting that we delivered around a saving of around 6,500 human hours on the project compared to what a full manual review would have taken. And I think there it's not just the time saving, but the actual speed of the transaction itself as well. So I guess in a similar statistic, we found that we're about 70% quicker to complete the review working in this way than we would have done if it was a full human review. We were able to review over 15,000 documents in less than 1 calendar month. And effectively, this method of using AI to do the heavy lifting meant that we could kind of review 20 times more documents than what you might have done in a manual review. So typically in a manual review, if time is of the essence and resources limited, what most organizations do is start to try and reduce the scope of the contract review and only look at material contracts. So therefore, you're kind of reducing the scope of what you might find in the process. So using technology in this way, again, kind of significantly reduced risk for Unilever because they were able to look at a much wider corpus of documents for kind of a similar cost in quicker times. Another interesting point that I think we're going to explore a little bit later on today is also the ability to, and the flexibility to kind of increase the scope throughout the project. So I think we started with 20 data points at the outset, but actually as we got about 4 weeks into the process and following some other conversations that were going on around the wider transaction, we recognized a need to abstract some data related to an additional 2 data points. Now, again, if that was a full human manual review, you'd have to go all the way back to phase 1 and start to review all those contracts again manually, which just wouldn't have been feasible. Instead, here, what we're able to do was build a model inside of a day for each of those data points and rerun that again across all the contracts in the matter of a couple of days. Again, doing a little bit more human validation of those outputs above, but it was just the flexibility in being able to do that I think really kind of got Unilever and certainly us quite excited about this prospect. I think the other point to kind of flag around this as well is that we did a little bit of testing around the accuracy of the data as well. I think one of the common misconceptions around AI is that it's not accurate enough, and that's one of the threats from kind of lawyers who look at it. But interestingly, and I think sadly to a lot of lawyers probably in the room today, is that humans aren't perfect either. And we did a little bit of sampling on this project and actually found that the methodology that we delivered here saw an 18% improvement in the accuracy of data than if we'd have just used humans to have reviewed this data. Just to quickly skip on and just to, I guess, bring this alive a bit for people who haven't kind of run a process in this way before, just wanted to quickly kind of talk about what the process looks like. So in a traditional kind of due diligence exercise, the starting point would be to kind of create the scope. So what are the documents that we're looking to review? What are the data points that we're looking to extract from them? And historically then you'd put a bunch of paralegals in a room and they would work through those contracts as quick as we could to pull out all of that data and essentially typically put it into a Microsoft Word document, being a due diligence report. And then essentially that report was just a tick box in an acquisition workflow to satisfy that the contracts had been reviewed and there were no major risks, but then the data kind of sits there almost as dumb data and doesn't really get used again. I think on the flip side, looking at the kind of tech-enabled version of this process, we did all the scoping at the beginning in the same way. We then ingested the contracts into the technology, and the technology then did a first-pass review of all these contracts, pulling out all the data points. Humans then go in and validate those outputs. So to this stage, fairly similar process. But I think what gets really interesting here then is the fact that the way that data then is captured in the platform and is then exported enables you to do a lot more interesting work around the kind of analysis. So we can spit out the DD reports just as you would in the manual process. But what we've actually got now is a standardized set of data that we can use for lots of different purposes. And we're going to talk a bit more about that today, but in terms of the different ways that you could then splice and kind of analyze that data because it's in such a structured format. I think the other interesting piece as well, not only from an analytics and review perspective, but also the fact that that data you can then use for other purposes throughout the transaction, which again, I'm going to touch on a little bit later. And I think just to conclude me talking before we bring some of the experts into the room, I guess the final bit, just to kind of do a bit of comparison here against kind of traditional versus tech-enabled, is a bit of a comparison on screen. So thinking about kind of a number of issues, I touched on this before, with AI, it's easier to look at a much broader number of data points because it's so much quicker in the process. So if you've got the same time limitations, you can probably view 2, 3, 4 times as many data points. You've also got that flexibility to add additional data points further throughout the process if you need to. Again, touched on this before, but kind of a volume of documents as well. Typically in a conventional sense, in a traditional sense, you'd limit the scope to material contracts. Again, in the interest of time of a transaction. Again, with AI, because you can churn through those contracts so much quicker, you can probably easily kind of process 10 to 20 times more documents, which again is minimizing risk for the client because you're not taking certain contracts out of scope. Again, I want to explore this a bit further on this session, but that use of data, rather than it just being kind of flat data in a Microsoft Word document that never gets reused, you've got this corpus of kind of live systemized data that you can push into other platforms and use elsewhere in the project and do a lot more analytics on that. I mean, I think finally on costs, it's typically a lot lower and certainly a lot more flexible. So in the traditional sense, it's very much kind of pricing based on input and human input. With this new way of working, there's kind of a fixed technology cost and then a human cost on top. It's a lot easier to kind of slice and change the scope to fit and meet budget, but actually to get a lot more kind of bang for your buck in terms of the financials.